the elite legal circles of New York, Marc S. Dreier was a name associated with quiet respect and success. He was the founder of Dreier LLP, a high-end law firm with prestigious offices and a client list filled with major corporate players. He moved through Manhattan with the unmistakable confidence of a man who belonged among the city's wealthy and powerful. But behind the gleaming glass offices and expensive suits, Dreier was meticulously engineering one of the most audacious financial fraud schemes ever carried out by a single attorney. Dreier had carefully constructed his reputation over decades. A graduate of top-tier schools, he honed his skills at respected firms before launching his own practice in the late 1992. He cultivated an image as a sophisticated deal-maker, smooth, composed, and unyieldingly aggressive when the situation demanded it. As his firm expanded, so too did the illusion of its success. The reality, however, was that the firm was hemorrhaging money. Dreier was burdened with lavish expenses required to maintain his image. High salaries for his staff, multiple luxury homes, a valuable art collection, and a lifestyle designed to impress potential clients and investors. Rather than scale back, he devised a plan to keep the entire enterprise afloat. By the mid-2000s, Dreier had begun a sophisticated campaign of forging financial documents and impersonating executives to secure hundreds of millions of dollars in investments. His primary tactic was the sale of fictitious promissory notes to hedge funds and other high-wealth investors. He claimed these notes originated from legitimate real estate or business clients who needed short-term financing to bridge a deal. In truth, the companies he cited often had no knowledge of these supposed deals. To make the offers appear legitimate, Dreier used counterfeit company letterhead, altered contracts, and even staged elaborate meetings with co-conspirators posing as executives. In one of his most brazen moves, he walked into the offices of a Canadian pension fund, pretending to be a senior executive from a major development company, complete with forged documents and a well-rehearsed pitch. Why do we instinctively trust individuals who project an aura of success and authority, even when presented with extraordinary claims? Investors placed their trust in him because he appeared to be a credible attorney, managing tens of millions in corporate assets. As investors purchased the fake notes, Dreier used the incoming cash to pay off earlier investors and fund his extravagant personal and professional expenses. It was, in effect, a one-man Ponzi scheme operating under the guise of high-stakes legal finance. He maintained the illusion with fake confirmations, doctored audit statements, and phone calls from burner phones. For a time, the system worked, but by late 2008, the global economy was in freefall. Investors grew cautious and began asking tougher questions, while the pool of new targets was rapidly shrinking. In a desperate attempt to secure more cash, Dreier attempted another impersonation in Toronto. This time, his story didn't hold up. He was detained by security after arousing suspicion. When he returned to the United States, federal agents were already closing in. In December 2008, the FBI arrested him in New York. The subsequent investigation revealed the breathtaking scale of his deception. He had sold nearly $700 million in fake notes and had been attempting to push that total toward $950 million. His law firm collapsed almost overnight, leaving employees stunned and clients in disarray. In 2009, Dreier pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Prosecutors described him as a man who built an empire on stolen trust, leveraging his status as a lawyer to bypass the skepticism that might have stopped anyone else. At his sentencing, Dreier expressed remorse, claiming his actions were driven by a desperate need to save his firm rather than by simple greed. The judge, however, rejected this narrative, sentencing him to 20 years in federal prison for what he described as a calculated and methodical deception. The fallout was immense, with many investors never fully recovering their losses. Dreier's case became a symbol of how easily professional authority can be manipulated. There were no threats or overt acts of violence, only supreme confidence, forged signatures, and privileged access to boardrooms where legitimacy was simply assumed. His story remains a cautionary tale used in discussions about financial oversight and the catastrophic choices that can be driven by unchecked ambition. When a fraud is perpetrated not by a shadowy outsider, but by a trusted professional within the system, does it suggest a failure of individual character or a systemic vulnerability in the way we validate trust? Before his conviction, James Candy Bottomley was known in California legal circles as a defense attorney with a reputation for confidence and a flair for persuasion. He had built a career on negotiating outcomes and handling tense disputes within the structured environment of the courtroom. What no one could foresee was how a personal entanglement would lead to a tragic confrontation, ultimately placing him on the opposite side of the justice system for the remainder of his life. At the center of the case was his relationship with Marietta Berberlis, a woman who had been not only his client but also his romantic partner. The relationship was described by those who knew them as complicated and unstable, marked by arguments and emotional volatility. By the late 1990s, the situation had reportedly evolved into a love triangle, with friends later testifying that tensions had been escalating for months. As he seemingly tried to maintain control over the relationship, Bottomley's behavior was observed to be increasingly erratic. The breaking point arrived in the year 2000. During what was intended to be a private conversation between Bottomley and Berberlis, the encounter turned fatal. Berberlis sustained multiple firearm injuries, and her life was tragically ended. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, Bottomley did not flee. Instead, he insisted that the event was unintentional, claiming the weapon had discharged during a struggle and that he had no plan to cause her harm. However, prosecutors immediately questioned this narrative. They argued that his actions showed intent and were driven by anger, not fear or panic. The fact that he brought a firearm to a personal meeting raised significant doubts about any claim of spontaneity. The case quickly drew attention, not just because of the tragic loss of life, but because a licensed attorney stood accused of causing the death of a former client and romantic partner. The legal proceedings that followed were closely watched. The prosecution laid out a narrative of jealousy, resentment, and an individual's inability to accept the end of a relationship. They emphasized the number of shots fired and the close proximity at which the event occurred. Forensic testimony suggested that once the violence began, there was little chance for escape. This evidence, combined with witness statements about the couple's volatile history, painted a picture of a man who had lost emotional control. The defense, in turn, repeatedly argued that the death was a tragic accident. They claimed Bottomley brought the firearm for protection or as an intimidation tactic that went horribly wrong, attempting to frame the shooting as a chaotic moment rather than a calculated decision. The jury, however, was not persuaded. They found James Bottomley guilty, and he was sentenced to 40 years to life in prison. The conviction reflected the court's conclusion that this was not a momentary lapse or a case of manslaughter, but a fatal act driven by possessiveness and emotion. For someone who had spent his career defending others, it was a dramatic and final reversal of roles. His law career ended instantly, his license was revoked, and he entered the correctional system as an inmate. The fact that his victim had once placed her professional trust in him added another layer of betrayal to the story. For legal analysts, his training and experience made his actions particularly troubling. He knew the full consequences of the legal system, yet that knowledge did not prevent the tragic outcome. How does a person trained to resolve conflict through logic and negotiation come to a point where violence seems like the only available response? Before his arrest, Edgar Steele was a figure known for his sharp legal mind and his alignment with controversial and extremist causes. He gained notoriety as the Aryan Nation's lawyer for his work on behalf of white supremacist organizations in the Pacific Northwest. While his clients and writings placed him on the fringes of public discourse, he maintained the professional image of an attorney with a family, a home, and a career defined by high-stakes courtroom battles and political advocacy. Few could have predicted that his most infamous case would be the one where he was the defendant. Steele resided in a rural part of northern Idaho with his wife, Cindy, and their family. Despite the public attention his legal work garnered, their life appeared outwardly conventional. Behind the scenes, however, a different reality was taking shape. Prosecutors would later argue that Steele was facing growing financial and personal pressures, leading him to a point of desperation. In 2010, federal investigators uncovered evidence of a disturbing plan. Steele was allegedly plotting to have his wife killed. The purported motive was a combination of a life insurance payout and the desire to begin a new life with another woman. What made the alleged plot even more complex was the reported attempt to disguise the act as politically motivated, a strategy designed to divert suspicion away from him and toward his ideological opponents. Authorities stated that Steele approached a handyman named Larry Fairfax with a request to carry out the act. According to the investigation, the plan involved rigging Cindy's vehicle with a destructive device, aiming to make her death appear as an act of retaliation from extremist groups. Unbeknownst to Steele, Fairfax did not agree to the plan. Instead, he contacted the FBI and became a cooperating witness. Under the supervision of federal agents, Fairfax recorded his subsequent conversations with Steele. These recordings would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. On the tapes, Steele was captured discussing, in detail, the timing, the method, and the critical importance of making the event look like a political attack. He also allegedly discussed a plan to target his mother-in-law. The FBI monitored Fairfax's interactions with Steele, but the investigation took an urgent and unexpected turn. Fairfax admitted to agents that he had already placed an explosive device under Cindy Steele's car before he had contacted them. This revelation forced law enforcement to move immediately. Agents successfully recovered the device before it could cause any harm, preventing the plan from reaching its lethal conclusion. When Steele was arrested in June 2010, the news was met with shock in both the extremist circles he frequented and the local community. He was charged with using interstate commerce facilities in the commission of murder for hire and possession of a destructive device. The fact that his own wife was the intended target added a deeply personal and unsettling dimension to the case. Initially, Cindy Steele refused to believe the allegations, publicly insisting that her husband was the victim of a government frame-up, targeted because of his controversial legal work and political beliefs. The trial, held in 2011, drew national attention. Prosecutors presented the recorded conversations to the jury, highlighting Steele's clear instructions and his calculated attempt to disguise the crime. They emphasized that this was not merely talk. A functional explosive device had been recovered from his wife's vehicle. The defense attempted to undermine the credibility of Larry Fairfax, portraying him as an unreliable and self-serving witness. They also argued that the recordings had been manipulated or misinterpreted. Despite these efforts, the jury found the evidence overwhelming. The taped conversations were explicit, and the physical recovery of the device corroborated the prosecution's narrative. Edgar Steele was convicted on multiple counts and was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence given his age. The judge noted the gravity of the offense and the extreme danger posed by the planned attacks. Even after his conviction, Steele maintained his innocence, and his wife continued to publicly support him, claiming the evidence was fabricated. However, his appeals were rejected, and the sentence was upheld. Steele died in federal custody in 2014 at the age of 69. His case remains a compelling study of how an individual, once entrusted with interpreting and upholding the law, could use his intellect to orchestrate a deadly plot against his own family, allegedly cloaking personal motives in the guise of political ideology. When an individual publicly embraces an extreme ideology, how does that influence our perception of their private motivations, and can it serve as a deliberate misdirection from more common human failings? Fun. Fred Tokars cultivated a public persona built on authority and influence. A former prosecutor in Atlanta, he later transitioned into private practice, establishing himself as a well-connected criminal defense attorney. To the outside world, His life appeared to be a model of success, complete with political allies, financial security, and a stable suburban family. He projected an image of control, intellect, and respectability. However, behind the courtroom appearances and business negotiations, Tokars was at the center of a burgeoning criminal enterprise founded on money laundering, drug trafficking, and fraud. The consequences of the secrets he kept would ultimately be borne by those closest to him. By the mid-1992s, Tokars had developed a reputation as a fixer for individuals operating outside the legal framework. He provided counsel to drug traffickers and facilitated the movement of their illicit funds through a network of shell companies and fabricated investments. He controlled several businesses that served as fronts for these activities, skillfully managing to remain below the radar of law enforcement. But while his criminal enterprise flourished, his personal life was beginning to disintegrate. His wife, Sarah Tokars, started noticing significant inconsistencies in their finances and grew suspicious of his involvement in illegal activities. Her fear mounted, and she confided in friends and family that she no longer trusted her husband and felt unsafe. For Tokars, this presented a critical threat, the possibility that his wife could expose his entire operation. On the 29th of November 1992, the carefully constructed facade was irrevocably shattered. Sarah returned to their Cobb County home with the couple's two young sons, Ricky and Mike, after a Thanksgiving visit with relatives. As they pulled into their driveway, an individual approached the vehicle. In a tragic act of violence that unfolded in front of the children, Sarah sustained fatal injuries from a firearm. The assailant fled the scene, leaving the two boys physically unharmed but deeply traumatized. The nature of the event drew immediate and intense media attention, prompting a comprehensive investigation. In the immediate aftermath, Tokars appeared on television, portraying himself as a devastated husband. However, detectives soon began to uncover details that pointed toward a different narrative. As investigators delved into Tokars' life, they unearthed the extensive money laundering operations he was running. They learned of his connections to organized drug traffickers and discovered that, despite his appearance of affluence, he was heavily in debt. It was reported that Sarah had been gathering information about his activities and was considering divorce, which raised the possibility that she might testify against him regarding his financial crimes. The prosecution would later allege that Tokars viewed his wife not as a partner, but as a liability who could dismantle everything he had built. To protect his interests, they argued, he arranged a murder-for-hire plot designed to permanently silence her. The investigation identified the assailant as Curtis Roa, who eventually admitted his involvement. Roa told investigators that Tokars and an associate, Eddie Lawrence, had orchestrated the entire plan. This testimony provided the crucial link authorities needed to connect Tokars directly to the incident. In a coordinated effort between federal agents and local prosecutors, the case against him expanded. He was charged with racketeering, conspiracy, and using criminal proceeds to sustain his lifestyle. The narrative presented by the prosecution was not merely about a man seeking to eliminate a witness. It was about an attorney deeply enmeshed in organized crime who used violence as a tool to protect his empire. Tokars was first tried in federal court on racketeering and financial crime charges. Witnesses provided detailed accounts of his involvement in moving drug-related money and described how he used his legal expertise to cover his tracks. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, a striking downfall for a man who once navigated the very legal system that now held him accountable. But the state of Georgia still sought justice specifically for Sarah's death. In 1997, prosecutors pursued murder charges, arguing he had directed the act to prevent her from speaking out. To avoid a potential death penalty, Tokars entered a plea agreement and received another life sentence. The trial coverage was intense, with news outlets focusing on the deeply troubling fact that the crime had occurred in the presence of his own children. It was a story of broken trust, the misuse of power, and a suburban life founded on a dangerous deception. Even after his convictions, Tokars' story continued to evolve. Facing multiple life sentences, he became a cooperating witness for federal authorities, providing information on other criminal figures he had worked with over the years. His insider knowledge of drug networks and financial schemes made him a valuable informant, and he was eventually placed in protective custody. His sons later testified about witnessing the traumatic event, and the emotional weight of their experience remained a central part of the case's public narrative. Over the years, his health declined, and he died in federal custody in 2020 at the age of 67. By then, his name had long become a reference point for a profound legal and moral collapse. His legacy is one of deception and destruction, a man who manipulated both the law and his personal relationships to protect a criminal enterprise, and when threatened, resorted to extreme violence. How does a case like this force us to reconsider the nature of trust we place in individuals who hold positions of legal authority? Before federal agents raided his office and home, Michael Cohen was best known to the world as the fiercely loyal personal attorney and fixer for Donald Trump. He was not a traditional courtroom litigator. Rather, he cultivated an identity as an operator who handled threats, managed disputes, and contained potential scandals before they could erupt into public view. For over a decade, he moved within Trump's inner circle with a reputation for intimidation, secrecy, and an unwavering loyalty. But when the full force of a federal investigation closed in, the man who once famously said he would take a bullet for his client found himself in a courtroom fighting for his own freedom. Cohen's career in law and business eventually led him to become a vice president of the Trump Organization, where he handled a wide array of legal and personal matters, from contract negotiations to confidential settlements. He embraced the lifestyle that came with such proximity to power, the luxury homes, the influential connections, and the authority that ensured his calls were always answered. However, his role as a fixer also placed him in situations that consistently blurred ethical and legal lines. The landscape shifted dramatically during and after the 2016 presidential campaign, as federal investigators began scrutinizing financial activities connected to hush money agreements with women who claimed to have had past relationships with Trump. The most prominent of these was a $130,000 payment made to adult film actress Stormy Daniels just weeks before the election. Prosecutors alleged that Cohen arranged this payment specifically to influence the outcome of the campaign, thereby violating federal election laws. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. In April 2018, the investigation escalated publicly when the FBI executed search warrants at Cohen's home, office, and hotel room, seizing phones, documents, and financial records. For a man accustomed to operating in the shadows, the raid was a stunning and public signal that his world was collapsing. By August 2018, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York charged Cohen with multiple felonies, including tax evasion, making false statements to a financial institution, and campaign finance violations. He ultimately entered a guilty plea, admitting in open court that he facilitated the payments at the direction of Individual 1, a reference universally understood to mean Donald Trump. Prosecutors detailed how Cohen had hidden more than $4 million in personal income from the IRS and had lied on loan applications. Separately, he also admitted to lying to Congress about the timeline of a proposed Trump Tower project in Moscow, an act intended to protect the political narrative during the campaign. Appearing for sentencing in December 2018, Cohen faced the complete unraveling of the life he had built. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. In their statements to the judge, prosecutors emphasized that his crimes were not the result of a single lapse in judgment, but were deliberate and sustained over a long period. While serving his sentence, Cohen's role underwent a final, dramatic transformation. He began cooperating with ongoing investigations and, in 2019, testified publicly before Congress. His testimony provided a rare insider's account of the Trump Organization's practices and the hush money arrangements, drawing intense media attention. In 2020, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Cohen was moved from prison to home confinement to serve the remainder of his sentence. The legal consequences, however, continued. He was officially disbarred in New York, permanently ending his career as a lawyer. After his release, he published a memoir and became a vocal critic of the very culture he once defended. Unlike a massive financial fraud or a violent criminal conspiracy, Cohen's crimes were rooted in secrecy, personal loyalty, and the apparent belief that proximity to power offered a shield from consequences. That illusion was shattered the moment federal prosecutors made their case public, closing the gap between political scandal and criminal accountability. In a system where personal loyalty to an individual is valued above institutional or legal principles, at what point does that loyalty cross the line into a criminal conspiracy, and who ultimately bears the greater responsibility? Before his arrest and conviction, Michael Avenatti was one of the most visible attorneys in America. He wasn't just known in legal circles. He was a fixture on national television, appearing almost daily to give interviews, debate commentators, and position himself as a fearless challenger of powerful figures. He represented celebrities, clashed with politicians, and for a time even hinted at a potential presidential run. To millions of viewers, he projected an image of a bold, sharp, and unstoppable advocate. But while the cameras were capturing his rapid ascent, federal investigators were already uncovering the financial misconduct that would bring his public persona crashing down. Avenatti built his brand on aggressive litigation and high-profile clients. Early in his career, he owned an aviation business and later ran a law firm that won major settlements in civil court by taking on large corporations. His celebrity status exploded when he began representing adult film actress Stormy Daniels in her legal disputes with President Donald Trump. Cable news networks gave him a constant platform, and he leaned into the spotlight, cultivating a massive social media following and publicly assailing his opponents. Behind the scenes, however, a very different story was unfolding. His finances were unraveling under the weight of extensive personal and business debt. Prosecutors would later reveal a pattern of diverting money from his clients to support his lavish lifestyle, allegedly using their settlement funds for private travel, luxury expenses, and firm operations without their consent. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. For years, this conduct remained largely hidden from public view. Then came the series of events that would shift his status from media personality to federal defendant. In March 2019, federal prosecutors in New York charged Avenatti with attempting to extort the sportswear giant Nike. According to the indictment, he threatened to hold a damaging press conference, accusing the company of illicitly funding amateur athletes unless Nike paid him more than $20 million. He allegedly demanded that the company either hire him for a massive fee to conduct an internal investigation or simply pay him to remain silent. What Avenatti didn't realize was that his conversations with Nike's attorneys were being recorded. The audio captured him outlining the consequences if his demands were not met, providing prosecutors with powerful evidence of what they described as a shakedown disguised as a legal negotiation. Just days after the Nike charges were announced, Avenatti was arrested. Simultaneously, federal investigators in California unsealed their own case against him, alleging he had stolen millions of dollars from clients by withholding settlement money and then lying about payment schedules. The accusations painted a grim picture. One client, a paraplegic man who had won a $4 million settlement, was reportedly given only small monthly stipends, while Avenatti allegedly spent the rest. Other clients claimed he had forged their signatures and fabricated updates to conceal the fact that their funds had been rerouted. The extortion trial in New York was the first to reach a jury. Prosecutors played the audio recordings, arguing they demonstrated a clear threat to inflict public damage if his financial demands weren't met. Though the defense claimed he was simply negotiating aggressively, the jury found him guilty in 2020 on charges of extortion and honest services fraud. This was followed by a separate trial in New York, related to his representation of Stormy Daniels, where prosecutors said he diverted nearly $300,000 from her book advance by forging instructions to her publisher. She testified against him, and he was convicted of wire fraud and identity theft. In California, he faced further charges of wire fraud and tax offenses for stealing from other clients. Between the three major cases, Michael Avenatti was sentenced to a combined total of 19 years in federal prison. The fall was as public and dramatic as his rise had been. The man once seen nightly on national news was now seen only in courtroom sketches and prison attire. He was disbarred, his law firm was shut down, and former supporters quickly distanced themselves. His case became a cautionary tale about the perils of an attorney who builds a career on publicity and aggression, demonstrating how quickly a reputation built on media exposure can be destroyed by concrete evidence. When a public figure uses their platform to advocate for justice, how do we distinguish between genuine advocacy and a form of self-promotion that may conceal personal misconduct? In the high-stakes legal and political arenas of South Florida, Scott W. Rothstein was more than just an attorney. He was a phenomenon. He projected an aura of limitless success, driving exotic cars, hosting extravagant parties, and donating millions to political campaigns. He built one of the most prominent law firms in the state with astonishing speed. And to any observer, he was the very definition of a power broker, a man with unparalleled influence, connections, and an endless supply of cash. But this lavish lifestyle was not the product of legal victories. It was a meticulously crafted illusion, sustained by one of the largest attorney-led Ponzi schemes in American history. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel to be the first to receive notifications when there are new videos. Rothstein co-founded the law firm Rothstein Rosenfeld Adler in Fort Lauderdale, quickly transforming it into a symbol of wealth and ambition. The offices were opulent, the staff was extensive, and the client list appeared to be a who's who of influential figures. He understood a fundamental principle: money could purchase perception. Judges, politicians, and business leaders frequented his events, accepted his generous donations, and regarded him as a rising legal titan. What almost no one knew was that the law firm was merely a stage. The real money came from a fraudulent investment operation that would ultimately exceed $1 billion in value. The scheme was deceptively simple and cloaked in the legitimacy of the legal profession. Rothstein presented investors with an opportunity to buy into what he called structured legal settlements. He claimed his firm represented plaintiffs who had won large, confidential settlements in cases related to sexual harassment, whistleblower claims, or employment disputes. According to his pitch, these plaintiffs preferred an immediate, discounted cash payout rather than waiting for long-term payments. He offered wealthy investors the chance to purchase these settlements, promising them substantial returns as the payments came in. Investors believed they were funding legitimate legal agreements, but in reality, the clients and the settlements were often complete fabrications. To maintain this elaborate deception, Rothstein and his associates created fake court documents, forged judges' signatures, and manipulated bank records. When a new investor was brought in, their money was used to pay off earlier investors, creating the illusion of consistent returns and keeping the operation afloat. This raises a critical question. How does the perceived authority and ethical standing of a law firm make a financial scheme seem not just plausible, but trustworthy? His personal lifestyle was a direct reflection of the scam's colossal scale. He acquired waterfront mansions, a collection of luxury watches, and a fleet of high-performance sports cars. He traveled by private jet and financed high-end restaurants. His donations extended to political campaigns, charities, and even law enforcement groups, all of which served to enhance his public image and build a firewall of credibility. People trusted him because his success seemed unassailable. Few were willing to question if the immense wealth surrounding him was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. By late 2009, however, the financial architecture began to collapse. The flow of new investment capital slowed, while existing investors were demanding their payouts. Facing an imminent implosion, Rothstein quietly fled to Morocco, a country that, at the time, lacked an extradition treaty with the United States for fraud. He would later claim he went there to think, not to permanently escape. But his sudden disappearance signaled the end was near. Within days, he returned to the U.S. and surrendered to federal authorities. Investigators quickly uncovered the staggering depth of the deception. The firm's accounts were empty, employees were left in shock, and investors came to the horrifying realization that they had lost hundreds of millions of dollars. The total fraud was estimated to be over $1.2 billion. In 2010, Scott Rothstein pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges, including racketeering, money laundering, and wire fraud. The evidence was overwhelming, consisting of the fake settlements, falsified bank correspondence, and the testimony of numerous investors. Prosecutors emphasized how he had leveraged his status as an attorney to make the scheme believable, exploiting the professional trust inherent in his position to lure his victims. The court, considering the sheer scale of the financial devastation, sentenced him to 50 years in federal prison. His downfall had a ripple effect that extended far beyond his own life. The collapse of his law firm resulted in the loss of hundreds of jobs, and political figures who had accepted his donations faced intense public scrutiny. While asset seizures allowed some investors to recover a portion of their money, many suffered permanent financial ruin. Rothstein's case is notable because it didn't involve violence or intimidation. Instead, he weaponized confidence, appearance, and the sterling reputation of a profession bound by a code of ethics. He built a powerful illusion of credibility and then used it to defraud investors on a breathtaking scale. In a culture that often measures success by visible wealth, how do we develop the critical discernment to separate authentic achievement from a masterfully constructed illusion? For many, Thomas Capano represented the pinnacle of success in Delaware. He was a wealthy attorney from an influential family, with deep political connections and a reputation for getting things done. But behind this carefully constructed facade of respectability, a very different story was unfolding, one that would culminate in one of the most notable criminal cases in the state's history. At the center of this narrative was his involvement with Anne Marie Fahey, a young scheduling secretary for the governor. Her disappearance would not only grip the nation, but also expose the hidden complexities of a man accustomed to being in control. Capano's life appeared to be one of privilege and stability. He hailed from a prominent Wilmington family, held significant legal positions, and navigated political circles with ease. While married with children, his personal relationships were fraught with complications. Those who knew him often pointed to his charm and confidence, but also a palpable sense of entitlement and a need to control every situation. In 1994, he entered into a relationship with Anne Marie Fahey, a woman more than a decade his junior, who was navigating her own emotional and self-image challenges. Friends of Fahey described the relationship as uneven. She confided in her diary that Capano was possessive, calling him manipulative and emotionally draining, and expressed a desire to break free. On the night of the 27th of June 1996, Fahey met Capano for dinner in Philadelphia. It was the last time anyone would see her. When Fahey failed to return home or appear for work, concern quickly escalated into a formal investigation. Her diary entries, which detailed her struggle to end the relationship with Capano, immediately drew investigators' attention to him. He was, after all, the last known person to have seen her alive. Initially, Capano presented a calm and cooperative demeanor, insisting their dinner was pleasant and they had parted ways amicably. But as law enforcement delved deeper, this narrative began to fray. Inconsistencies emerged in his statements, and his story about where he dropped her off seemed to change. For someone so close to a missing person investigation, his composure struck many as unusual. The critical breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Capano's own brother, Jerry. He eventually admitted to authorities that he had helped Thomas dispose of a large, heavy object at sea, using a rented boat. This admission formed the cornerstone of the prosecution's theory that Fahey's life was tragically ended inside Capano's home, and her body was then concealed in a cooler, taken offshore, and submerged in the Atlantic Ocean. Despite an extensive search, Fahey's remains were never recovered. This absence of direct physical evidence presented a significant challenge. How can you secure a murder conviction without a body? Yet, the circumstantial evidence was mounting. Witnesses came forward with troubling details, including a former girlfriend who testified Capano had asked her to store a firearm for him around the time of the disappearance. Another brother, Lewis, provided testimony that further implicated him. Investigators even located the cooler believed to have been used in the disposal, though its lid was missing. By the time the trial began in 1998, the case was a national media spectacle. The prosecution presented a motive rooted in control and obsession, arguing that Capano, unable to accept rejection, was the person responsible for Fahey's death after she tried to permanently end their relationship. They meticulously laid out a timeline connecting his movements, the boat rental, the missing cooler, and the powerful testimony from his own family. The defense, in turn, attempted to dismantle this narrative by challenging the credibility of key witnesses and suggesting alternative scenarios. Ultimately, the jury found the prosecution's circumstantial case compelling. Thomas Capano was convicted of first-degree murder and subsequently sentenced to death, a rare outcome for an individual of his professional and social standing. The verdict reverberated nationwide. The case was dissected in books, televised specials, and news reports, all highlighting the stark contrast between Capano's polished public image and the violent acts for which he was found responsible. Years later, his death sentence was overturned on appeal and commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated, his identity forever transformed from a respected attorney to a symbol of entitlement and concealed violence. The fascination with the case endured long after the trial. Legal analysts and true crime documentarians frequently revisited it, often using it as a case study for how a conviction can be secured on the strength of overwhelming circumstantial evidence. For many, the story served as a chilling reminder of how status and influence can mask underlying danger. In 2011, Thomas Capano was found unresponsive in his prison cell and was later pronounced dead, closing a chapter that had haunted the community for over a decade. Yet, the legacy of the case persists. His fall from grace remains a powerful cautionary tale about the collision of power, secrecy, and control, demonstrating the fragile line between public success and private destruction. To what extent can a person's public achievements and social status obscure a capacity for destructive behavior? And what does this reveal about our own perceptions of success? For nearly a century, the Murdaugh family name was synonymous with power in South Carolina's Low Country. They operated one of the region's most influential law firms and held prosecutorial authority for generations, creating a dynasty whose influence extended through courtrooms, politics, and local systems that seldom challenged their authority. It was a legacy of legal and social dominance. So, when Alex Murdaugh, a prominent attorney and the heir to this dynasty, placed a 911 call reporting that his wife and youngest son had lost their lives on their rural estate, the news sent shockwaves far beyond the local community, capturing the attention of the entire nation. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. Before the tragic events, Alex Murdaugh lived a life steeped in privilege. His family's legal empire provided him with access, protection, and a reputation that seemed impenetrable. Outwardly, his life mirrored the archetypal image of a successful Southern attorney, a sprawling estate known as Moselle, powerful social connections, and a family with his wife, Maggie, and two sons, Paul and Buster. But behind this polished facade, significant troubles were mounting. His own law firm had begun to suspect him of misappropriating millions of dollars from client settlements. Lawsuits were accumulating, and his son Paul was facing serious criminal charges connected to a fatal boating incident that had already cast a harsh spotlight on the family. How much pressure can a life, even one built on a foundation of power, withstand before it begins to fracture? On the night of the 7th of June 2021, that fracture became a catastrophic collapse. Alex called 911, stating he had discovered Maggie and two-year-old Paul near the dog kennels on the Moselle property, both having sustained fatal injuries from firearms. First responders described a scene where Alex appeared distraught, yet also offered detailed timelines of his movements. Given Paul's pending legal case over the death of Mallory Beach in the boat crash, initial speculation immediately turned to the possibility of retaliation. But as investigators began to meticulously piece together the evidence, inconsistencies in Alex's account started to emerge. For months, he steadfastly maintained that he was not near the kennels at the time the events were believed to have occurred. However, digital forensics would tell a different story. Cell phone data, video evidence recovered from his son's phone, and witness testimony would later place him at the scene just minutes before the estimated time of the deaths. Simultaneously, the full extent of his financial desperation was coming into focus. His law partners confronted him about missing funds, and civil cases threatened to expose years of professional misconduct. The timing raised critical questions about motive. Prosecutors would eventually construct a theory that the events of that night were a calculated, albeit desperate, attempt to create a distraction from his crumbling professional and financial world. The investigation took another bizarre turn in September 2021. Alex reported that he had been shot in the head on the side of a highway. This incident was later revealed to have been a staged event, allegedly arranged by Alex himself with an accomplice, so that his surviving son could collect on a life insurance policy. This act of deception severely undermined his credibility and invited far more aggressive investigative scrutiny. In July 2022, after a year-long investigation, Alex Murdaugh was formally charged with the deaths of his wife and son. The prosecution alleged he used two different firearms in an effort to divert attention from the imminent exposure of his extensive financial crimes. The trial, which began in January 2023, became a national spectacle, televised and streamed to millions. Viewers were captivated by the dramatic fall of a man whose family had, for generations, been the arbiters of justice in that very region. The prosecution's case hinged on several key pieces of evidence, most notably a cell phone video taken by Paul just minutes before he died. In the background of the clip, Alex's voice could be clearly heard, directly contradicting his repeated alibi that he was nowhere near the kennels. This was coupled with detailed financial records showing that on the very day of the deaths, Alex had been confronted by his law partners about the missing money. The defense countered by arguing that there was no direct physical evidence linking Alex to the scene and suggested the possibility of unknown assailants. They portrayed his behavior as consistent with that of a grieving husband and father. However, the prosecution's narrative, weaving together timeline, motive, and a pattern of lies, proved persuasive. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned a guilty verdict in less than 3 hours. In March 2023, Alex Murdaugh was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. This, however, was only one chapter of his legal downfall. He later pleaded guilty to dozens of financial crimes, including embezzling millions from vulnerable clients, many of whom were family friends or relatives of individuals who had died in accidents. His once powerful law firm collapsed and rebranded, and civil suits continue to seek compensation for the victims of his fraud. The case has been called a trial of the century, not just for its sensational details, but because it exposed the profound collapse that can occur when decades of privilege and protection finally expire. When a single family holds significant influence over a region's legal system for generations, what challenges does that pose to the ideal of impartial justice when a member of that family stands accused? Before his downfall, Paul W. Bergrren was an attorney spoken of with a certain reverence in legal circles. His background read like that of a model legal professional. As a former federal prosecutor in New Jersey, he had taken on high-profile narcotics and organized crime cases. He later transitioned into private practice, becoming a defense attorney for the very types of organizations he once worked to dismantle. He projected an image of success, with expensive suits, an elite clientele, and a reputation for being a formidable presence in the courtroom. But the same instincts that made him a powerful force within the justice system would eventually draw him into a world of organized crime. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please let me know where you saw this video. I will read it all and spread it around the world. Over the years, Bergrren cultivated a client base that included individuals associated with gangs, drug trafficking, and other criminal enterprises. His role, however, evolved beyond that of a legal defender. Investigators would later uncover that he wasn't just representing clients within the criminal world, he was actively participating in it. Behind his polished professional image, authorities alleged he was using his legal access to coordinate large-scale drug operations, arrange payments for illicit activities, manage a prostitution enterprise, and tamper with witnesses. What makes his story particularly compelling is the apparent ease with which he transitioned from an officer of the court to an architect of criminal conspiracies. This raises a fundamental question. Where is the ethical boundary for a legal professional, and what could motivate someone sworn to uphold the law to cross it so decisively? The first clear indication of this shift emerged from a federal case involving one of his clients, a gang member named William Baskerville. As prosecutors prepared their case, a key witness was set to testify. Instead of focusing solely on a courtroom defense, Bergrren allegedly delivered a message that would later be cited in court proceedings. No witness, no case. Subsequently, that witness, a man named Kimo McRae, tragically lost his life to violence. Investigators allege that Bergrren was directly involved in the plan to eliminate the witness to protect his client. At that point, any distinction between legal strategy and criminal conspiracy appeared to have vanished. Federal agents began to monitor Bergrren more closely, believing his law office was serving as a front for a network of racketeering activities, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and organized prostitution. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. When Berggren's clients faced charges, witnesses were often subjected to intimidation or, in some cases, removed as threats, while profits from criminal enterprises were channeled through his connections. He seemed to wield the principle of attorney-client privilege as a shield, perhaps assuming it made him immune to scrutiny. By 2009, law enforcement agencies, including the FBI and DEA, had built a comprehensive case against him, utilizing the RICO statutes originally designed to dismantle powerful crime families. The indictment alleged that Bergrren had ordered or facilitated multiple conspiracies to silence witnesses across different cases. He was also accused of assisting clients in running drug operations while advising them on methods to evade detection. The prostitution ring he allegedly oversaw involved transporting women and laundering the proceeds through his associates. In public statements, officials expressed their dismay, with the FBI calling his conduct a stunning betrayal of the justice system itself. The outrage stemmed not just from the crimes, but from the fact that an individual with intimate knowledge of the law had used that status to empower the very criminal elements he once prosecuted. When his trial commenced in early 2013, it captured significant media attention. In a move that displayed immense confidence, Bergrren chose to represent himself during parts of the proceedings. He attempted to undermine witness credibility, challenge investigative methods, and frame the charges as exaggerations based on unreliable testimony. However, the prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including wiretaps, recorded conversations, financial records, and testimony from cooperating witnesses. They illustrated how his legal career had become a cover for intimidation, trafficking, and extortion. Testimony from former associates painted a consistent and damning picture. Bergrren was not merely a facilitator of crime, but a commander. Witnesses recounted instances where he personally discussed the elimination of a potential witness and helped manage drug money, all while positioning himself as an untouchable figure. In March 2013, the jury delivered its verdict. Paul W. Bergrren was convicted on all major counts, including conspiracy related to the unlawful death of a witness, drug trafficking, racketeering, and operating a prostitution enterprise. At sentencing, prosecutors argued that his actions had caused profound damage, not only by placing lives at risk, but also by eroding public trust in the legal profession. The court concurred, sentencing him to life in federal prison with no possibility of release. For a man accustomed to controlling outcomes, it was a definitive and irreversible conclusion. His name, once synonymous with legal prowess, became a cautionary tale of unchecked power and ethical collapse. In the years that followed, Bergrren continued to maintain that he was unfairly targeted, but the evidence presented in court told a different story. His fall from a federal prosecutor to a lifelong inmate remains one of the most dramatic legal collapses in recent American history, a gradual descent into a world he once pledged to combat. When an individual entrusted with upholding the law becomes its most cynical manipulator, does it reveal a flaw in the person or a vulnerability within the system itself?